Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by J Bowman. This is the latest video in my series comparing the Olympus EM1 Mark III and the OM System OM1 Mark II. And in this video I will be giving my initial and tentative views on image quality. I received a few requests to do this image quality comparison, but I should say up front that this may be the most controversial video in this comparison series, as I think this is the area where the idea of the OM1 II representing an upgrade over the EM1 III becomes most contestable. Having gone through a detailed review of photos I've shot with the EM1 III and the OM1 II in equivalent conditions, sometimes even at the same time, my view is that for me there is no meaningful improvement in overall image quality moving from the EM1 III to the OM1 II. To refine this view slightly, both cameras have the same lovely Olympus colours which I find very attractive. In terms of low light performance, if I pixel peep at the images, which I don't generally do, I do find a slight improvement in noise performance in the OM1 II over the EM1 III. Perhaps by as much as one stop difference. However, and this is probably going to be the most controversial part of my judgment, I have noticed that in some instances the OM1 II noise filter is acting in a more aggressive manner than the noise filter in the EM1 III, which is potentially impacting fine details in some of my photos. I want to stress that I have not been able to conclusively rule out user error in contributing to this last finding, so please do take this with a pinch of salt. I will lay everything out in this video with plenty of images to support my conclusions, so please stick around to the end to get the whole picture. In the interests of making this video as succinct as possible, I'm not going to repeat in this video any information I have given in either of my previous videos, so if you've not already done so, I would recommend that you go and watch those previous videos first. I will say that each video I make in this series has the benefit of more time and experience with both cameras, so I'm constantly having to update my understanding of the OM1 II in particular. If I do manage to complete the series with a final video on autofocus performance, then I think I would probably then also have to do a final video just updating some of my findings and conclusions from all of the previous videos. However, I'm not going to get into all of that today in this video, which is going to focus as closely as I can on image quality. Before I get into the detailed comparison, there are a few things I need to say. First, I will repeat again that from my perspective, I do not think that there is a meaningful difference in image quality between these two cameras. If you zoom into images and pixel peep, then you can notice differences, but that is not something I or the people I share my photos with generally do. There are plenty of reasons to move from the EM1 III to the OM1 II, but if your aim is to upgrade in terms of image quality, then I would not recommend ditching the EM1 III for the OM1 II. But this is subject to the caveat I'm going to make in the next point. So my second point is that I've tried to split my comparison into 3 separate videos, dealing in turn with physical hardware, image quality, and autofocus. But really this is a false division. At the end of my previous video on hardware, I pointed out how the improved performance of the OM1 II allows me, or rather encourages me, to take images I would not have attempted with the EM1 III. I would say that logically, those images which are taken must be of better quality than the images which were not taken, unless we are going to delve into some very murky philosophical territory. So in expanding the shooting envelope, the OM1 II tends to expand image quality in certain ways. There are certain improvements to the hardware or autofocus which are going to straightforwardly improve image quality. If the autofocus is more accurate, then the images are going to be sharper, which would generally be considered to be a quality improvement. In turn, if the images are better, then that encourages me to shoot more and to get more familiar with the hardware, etc., etc. So you can see that these 3 topics of camera hardware, image quality, and autofocus performance cannot be rigorously delineated. Thirdly, Let's get back to reality and look at some images. These are my favourite photos, or I should say my favourite non-family portrait photos from October 2025. This is the first full month in which I have had both the EM1 III and the OM1 II. And you can see that there is a pretty even split between photos taken with these two cameras. Photos 1, 2 and 4 are taken with the OM1 II. Photos 3 and 5 are taken with the EM1 III. What does this tell us? Obviously, it's very subjective on my part. This whole video is very subjective. But speaking subjectively, when I look at the files at standard size in OM Workspace, I cannot readily tell an EM1 III photo from an OM1 II photo without looking at the EXIF data. I really want to reinforce that point again. Reinforce it. Fourthly, I need to make another confession. In my previous video, I made a couple of confessions about the way I use my cameras. Here, I have to confess that I fear I am quite a lazy photographer. I do not want to, in fact, I should say I will not carry a tripod. I will not carry filters. I will not carry a camera bag. I will not run two camera or lens systems. I will not carry spare batteries. I will not use a flash unless I absolutely have to. Maybe it is my laziness that makes me a perfect fit for Olympus cameras. I will not use specialist noise reduction software. I will shoot RAW, but I also shoot JPEG, and generally I will use the JPEG for everything. On the rare occasions when I do carry out extensive edits on a RAW file, after all of my efforts, the end result generally ends up looking disturbingly similar to the original JPEG. Sometimes I will post photos to the Micro Four Thirds internet forum. A couple of times a month I email photos to my family. Once a year I print an A3 photo book. Very occasionally I will shoot an event for friends or family. In fact, I'm shooting a birthday party with the OM1 II this evening. But that's it in terms of my output. And now a final confession. Beyond a certain point, I don't really care about image quality, and I've never bought a camera based on studio tests of noise levels and similar factors. I don't even really look at them. All of this is to explain that what I'm going to look at in this video is almost exclusively straight out of camera JPEGs. Those 5 photos I just showed are edited JPEGs produced using OM Workspace only. All other images I show in this video will be unedited JPEGs unless indicated otherwise. Given this confession, the majority of what I say in this video will probably be of limited relevance for photographers who post-process their images, who use masks and plugins and noise reduction software. For them, I suspect the performance of the camera JPEG engine and noise filter is much less important. Fifthly, and this is my last point, I have to confess that user error, or at least user unfamiliarity with the OM1 II, may play a role in what follows. This fifth confession takes us into the image comparison proper, and I'm going to start with an issue I have noticed, where in certain circumstances the OM1 II noise filter seems to be suppressing fine detail more aggressively than the EM1 III noise filter. I'm going to call this issue Bobblegate, for reasons which will become clear. I want to stress that at this stage the photos I've taken in my first month with the OM1 II suggest that Bobblegate might really be an issue, but I do not have enough data at this point to nail down what is really going on here and whether it really is a problem. First section, Bobblegate. So this is the first section of my image comparison, and here I'm going to be looking at fine detail in portraits and smoothing from the camera's noise reduction algorithm. Very soon after I first received my OM1 II, I had some family staying with me, and of course the temptation was to photograph them with my new camera rather than my old dependable EM1 III. However, even whilst I was shooting, I noticed that some of the photos I was taking with my new OM1 II seemed to be coming out noticeably less sharp than I would have expected from my EM1 III. They gave me the impression that the OM1 II was applying an overzealous noise filter and smoothing the detail, particularly out of areas of the portraits which, while not completely in focus, are close to the zone of focus, and so need to have enough detail to prevent the photo looking fake or plastic. Let me show a few examples here. These are all extracts at 1:1 from larger portrait photos. As I've mentioned previously, I'm not going to show my family members' faces in my videos, which rather restricts the evidence I can present here. In fact, you'll have to take my word that the faces in all of these photos are generally pretty sharp. It is these slightly out of focus areas where I'm having an issue and notice the smoothing. All of these photos were taken with the OM1 II and my 25mm f1.2 Pro, and they were all shot wide open at base ISO. This is a lens I've been using for more than 5 years for exactly this type of photo, so the only variable which was changing was the camera. So let's take a look at the skin in this hand here, shot wide open at f1.2, ISO 200 with a shutter speed of 1/1000, and here we are viewing at 1:1. Some of the detail that I would expect to see just isn't there in this image. It seems smoothed. I accept that it's quite subtle, but I'm afraid a lot of this video is going to be quite subtle and subjective. Now let's look at this snip of this hat. Again shot wide open at f1.2, ISO 200, shutter speed of 1/2500 and viewing at 1:1. Here I want to focus on the lack of detail in the fibres in the hat, in the hair, and particularly in the earring. Again, all of these elements look smoothed or smeared. In the photo proper, the face is in focus and relatively sharp, but it is in these adjacent areas where I would expect to see detail, but can't. Again, the same thing here in this image, shot wide open at f1.2 at ISO 200 and 1/1600th of a second. Let's try not to get distracted by the beautiful feather bouquet in the background. What strikes me here is that there is no detail in the hair, and there is some apparent fudging going on in the hairline area. Now, there are a number of factors which could be at play here. To me, this smoothing looks like over-aggressive noise reduction. Due to an unfortunate series of accidents which I won't go into, for once in my life at this particular family gathering, I ended up shooting JPEG only with no RAW backup, so I cannot go back and reverse engineer these shots. Of course, I didn't realise this fairly catastrophic error until later. To me, in the very early days of using the OM1 II, this was quite a disheartening experience, because these images are of worse quality than I would have captured with my EM1 III, and as I say, due partly to my own error. I had been shooting in JPEG only, and so I cannot undo the noise filter which has been applied to these photos. When I got back home, I realised that I have the noise filter on my EM1 III set to low, where it has probably remained for 5 years, whereas the noise filter on the OM1 II is set to standard by default. So does changing the noise filter level fix the issue? At this point, for context, let's look at this image of a hat and hair I shot with my EM1 III earlier this year. Same lens, same wide open aperture, same base ISO. This shot is at 1/1000th of a second. To me, there is a lot more detail in this photo. This is the level of detail I was expecting to see in my OM1 II shots and wasn't. I'm open to the possibility that user error is at fault to some extent here in reducing the quality of the OM1 II images. For example, on the afternoon when I was taking the portrait photos of my family, one of my family members who is a photographer mentioned that I had some dust on the front element of my lens. True, there was some dust on the front element, but that dust had presumably been there for some time and does not seem to have affected the images I shot with my EM1 III in the month before I got my OM1 II. I cleaned my lens, and possibly that did reduce the effect of this particular issue, but it's not removed it entirely. Finally, on Bobblegate, let's compare two photos taken on the same beach later in October. This first photo is taken with the EM1 III, same 25mm Pro lens, wide open, ISO 200, 1/6000. Look at the detail in the hat and hair, particularly in the bobble. That is the detail I expect to see when I nail focus on my EM1 III with the 25mm Pro. This next photo was taken a few minutes earlier on the same beach with the OM1 Mark II, with the same 25mm Pro lens, wide open, ISO 200, 1/5000. I should point out that I do have the RAW file for this photo, and so I have opened it in OM Workspace, set the noise reduction to low, and export it as a JPEG. An extract of that is what you are looking at here. The bobble is smaller in the photo here and the lighting is worse. But even with those differences, I think you can see the smoothing in comparison to the previous photo I showed. In fact, let me put both up next to each other as a comparison. So even with the noise filter in the OM1 Mark II set to low, you can see the difference in the fine detail captured here. So let's wrap up on Bobblegate by saying that my initial finding in my first month of using the OM1 II is that the standard setting for noise filter in the OM1 II reduces fine detail in portraits in a way which I find unacceptable. I have now set the noise filter to low in the OM1 II, and we'll see going forward whether that produces more acceptable results, which are on a par with the equivalent photos taken with my EM1 III. As already shown in this video, my finding is that editing the OM1 II RAW files to change the noise filter to low still produces inferior photos to the EM1 III, at least on this particular point of comparison. I understand, although I'm prepared to be corrected on this, that OM system cameras apply noise reduction even in their RAW files, which you cannot remove altogether even if you set noise reduction to off. And so there is a degree of noise filtering in the OM1 II which is inescapable. Is this an area where the different sensor of the OM1 II is producing inferior results to the EM1 III? I'm not sure. Only time will tell. But if anyone watching has experience of this issue, please do let me have your views in the comments. Second section, noise. Okay, having said what I just said about Bobblegate, I want to say that in general, my impression is that the OM1 II handles noise itself, as opposed to the fine detail issues I've already mentioned, slightly better than the EM1 III. I actually quite like the noise in the EM1 III, at least up to ISO 1600, which is generally the upper limit of what I would shoot at. I think the OM1 II has a similar character of noise, but it's slightly finer and better handled. On the OM1 II, I would probably increase my upper limit from 1600 to 3200. So I will now show a series of photos, each shown first at standard resolution and then at 1:1 crop. All of these photos are straight out of camera JPEGs with no edits in the case of the EM1 III. For the OM1 II, I have opened the RAW files in OM Workspace to set the noise filter to low and then exported the photos with no further edits. First, for context, I will show some higher ISO images from the EM1 III, all of which were shot in September 2025 at either ISO 800 or ISO 1600. Hopefully these photos will give you a flavour of the noise character of the EM1 III at those ISO levels with the low noise filter setting enabled. At 800 ISO, the noise reminds me of the sort of very fine grain you would see in low ISO analog film, although I do have to say that it has been very many years since I've shot film. At 1600 ISO, sometimes the noise is still pretty smooth, but at other times it starts to get a bit rougher, maybe more like bog standard 400 ISO analog film. Now let's look at some higher ISO images from the OM1 II, which I shot in October 2025. Actually, the first image of the fly is at ISO 500, and I included it just to show how smooth the noise is when shooting below 800 ISO on the OM1 II. It's very hard to detect any noise here at all. There's an image of a bee here which is shot at 1250 ISO, which I would say is as smooth as 800 ISO on the EM1 III. This photo of flowers here at 1600 ISO actually looks a little bit rough, but in this instance I think the roughness comes more from the fact that I was shooting at a small aperture, and I think the busy bokeh and likely diffraction is exaggerating the grain. Now this next shot of the pylon and the will-o'-the-wisp is shot at 1600 ISO and is deep into sunset. If you pixel peep, you can see some coloured noise in the shadows of the trees. There is also very little detail here, possibly harking back to Bobblegate. But in this particular case, I think for this photo the lack of detail works. In this squirrel shot at 3200 ISO, I think the fur is quite detailed, but you can definitely see some smoothing in the branches. This photo of a slug on a mushroom shot at 1600 ISO does feel like an 800 ISO shot on the EM1 III. This photo of a sheep was shot at 3200 ISO after the sun had gone down, basically in the dark. I think this shot looks much better on the OM1 II than it would have done on the EM1 III. Then this final shot of the bat I've included just for a laugh really. This was shot after dark and I could feel the bat flitting above my head. I decided to open my lens to f1.2, zone focus on the area where I thought the bat was flying and take some shots. Now at the time I had thought I was shooting at 3200 ISO. But when I looked at the EXIF files later, I was amazed to see that I was actually shooting at 32,000 ISO. I would never normally consider shooting at this ISO, and I couldn't shoot at this level on the EM1 III, as the highest ISO possible there is 25,600. Objectively speaking, it's not a great shot, but again, it's interesting to see how high the ISO on the OM1 II can go, and it hints at the possibilities of this camera. Could I salvage something usable from this photo with further noise reduction software? So to conclude, in terms of noise levels at higher ISO, I think the OM1 II does perform slightly better than the EM1 III. It's not a huge difference, approximately one stop, but it is noticeable to me, at least when you compare the photos at 1:1. Third section. Colours and general image quality. Now, in this final section, let's look at colours and general image quality. First, let's look in a bit more detail at this shot of these canal boats, where I used the same lens and exposure settings and shot these two photos on the EM1 III and OM1 II a few seconds apart. The framing is very slightly different, but aside from that, I think they are very, very, very similar. So similar that I find it very hard to say which I prefer. This just shows that unless you pixel peep, and sometimes even if you do pixel peep, the image quality between these two cameras is almost identical. They both have the Olympus look. So I will close out this video with a selection of some more of the photos which I took with the OM1 II in October 2025. These are all straight out of camera JPEGs, which have been selected to demonstrate the colours and general image quality of the OM1 II. I would mention that they also indirectly demonstrate the colours and general image quality of the EM1 III, since the photos from these two cameras have such a similar look to them. Conclusion. In conclusion, I will reiterate that in my personal view, for my uses at least, there is no meaningful difference in image quality between the EM1 III and the OM1 II. Some photos I have taken with the OM1 II suggest that in some instances the OM1 II noise filter may act more aggressively in smoothing out fine detail than the noise filter in the EM1 III. so-called Bobblegate. But I need to do some more experimentation to come to a firm view on that point. Leaving aside that issue, in general, I think the OM1 II handles noise in higher ISO settings slightly better than the EM1 III. But otherwise, I think the image quality in both cameras is great and is more than adequate for my needs. Please let me know in the comments below whether you agree with my findings and what your experience has been using either the EM1 III or the OM1 Mark II. Finally, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please give me a like and a subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video. Goodbye.